Please join me in welcoming to San Jose not only a popular writer but a true literary lion, and this year's Martha Heasley Cox Lecture, George Plimpton.
Well, thank you very much for those very kind words. And thank you, Martha, for the chance to come here and speak to you. Next week in Boston, they're going to be running the Boston Marathon. And I think it was there in Boston, indeed in the marathon, many years ago, that this idea of what's called participatory journalism came to me. I was trying very hard to get onto the humor magazine at Harvard College, which is called the Lampoon, the Harvard Lampoon. And to get onto that publication, you had to go through a kind of initiation, very much like joining a fraternity. And what the editors of this magazine insisted that I do was to run in the Boston Marathon, which, as you know, is a 26-mile long race, ends up on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. They did not specify, however, these editors, that I had to run the race from the start. And so I was prudent enough to enter about a block and a half from the finish. And I entered it immediately behind the fellow who was leading the race. And the last time he looked over his shoulder, there wasn't anybody in sight at all. And he was coming down Commonwealth Avenue with this great crowd cheering him on, when all of a sudden, behind him, he heard the pounding of sneakers. And he looked over his shoulder, and there I was, fresh as a daisy. I'd only run about 15 yards. And this poor man put on a desperate sprint, which is quite a feat if you've run 26 miles. And he managed to cross the finish line before I did, which will give you some sense of my speed afoot. As soon as we crossed the finish line, we were taken off by these track officials to a press tent to be interviewed. I really had very little wish to go to the press tent to be interviewed, had very little to tell them about this race, only been in it for about 2 minutes. But I had no choice. We were hustled off to this press tent, and there, of course, it was discovered that I was an imposter. All of this had to be practically translated to the man who had won the race. He was in a near comatose state. And when he was made to realize that he'd been forced to sprint after 26 miles by a fellow who'd run less than 3 city blocks, he rose up off this little stool that he was sitting on, and with absolute justification, he tried to pop me one. So exhausted he couldn't raise his arm. So I was able to get out of that press tent, scuttling out of there without being damaged. It was a dreadful thing to have done to this distinguished long-distance runner, and I've always had great regrets about it, but I do think it was there, running down Commonwealth Avenue with this little tracksuit on, with a number 1/4 on a little placard dangling down my back, and getting some sense of what it was truly like to be in a great marathon that may have put this concept of participatory journalism in my mind. Well, most people, when they get out of college, as you know, they settle down to their chosen professions, and they pretty much stick to them. There are exceptions. Those of you who have been to Spain or Mexico may have seen these extraordinary people called the espontaneo. And they are young kids who become possessed by the national daydream in those countries, which is to, of course, fight the bulls. And if you go to some of the great bullfights, sometimes you see them. They smuggle these muletas in under their sweaters, and they sort of work their way down towards the floor of the arena. And when the bull comes out in the very beginning of the bullfight, one of these espontaneos, they're called, will leap across the barrera and rush out there and try to play him. Very dangerous. It's against the law. They either end up in jail or in a hospital. But for one blinding instant, they've been able to play out this daydream that seems to infect so many of them. I came out here to California a couple of years ago to interview a most curious sort of an espontaneo, and some of you may remember this fella. He was a Vietnam veteran from Long Beach, and he got it into his head one day that he wanted to fly. And his conveyance for doing this was a most curious one, a deck chair. The idea was he was going to settle himself into this deck chair, to which were attached some 22 odd helium-filled weather balloons. And he was going to rise out of his girlfriend's backyard in Long Beach. I've been there. It's an area about 1/10 the size of this room. Bird bath at one end and an iron flamingo, I remember, at the other. Rise up out of this yard, Long Beach, and in the deck chair with him he carried an air pistol. And the way he was going to regulate his altitude was that he was going to, when he got up to about 500 feet or so, he was going to take out this air pistol and start popping these balloons. And that was going to regulate his altitude as he was carried east in the prevailing winds, his girlfriend traveling along below in an Oldsmobile to pick him up when he came down. Well, the great day came must be about 8 years ago. Got into this deck chair, just the ordinary sort of deck chair that you could buy at a Kmart. Strapped himself in, the tethering ropes were cut, and he rose swiftly out of this backyard. And he got up to about 500 feet or so, and he reached for this air pistol to start popping these balloons. And the air pistol fell between his knees to the ground. And this fellow in his deck chair went up 16,900 feet. And he drifted into the air patterns of LAX. Now, many of you may have read Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, which is about the early days of the astronauts. And in there, he talks about how when you get into a storm, these enormously soothing voices of the pilots come on, usually Texas accented, and they sort of calm you down. Well, I have a tape of these same pilots who have looked out the window at 16,000 feet and seen a guy drifting by in a deck chair. And these voices have got nothing to do with Texas macho at all. They're high, querulous squawks of astonishment and dismay. This fellow came down safely, you'll be pleased to hear. He came down about 23 miles from where he started, came down in the backyard of a policeman who was sitting there in his deck chair reading a copy of the Los Angeles Sunday Times. Great crash, and this fellow landed in his deck chair. You might be interested in what the authorities did about this, the FAA, Federal Aeronautics Agency. They felt they ought to do something. This fellow had been flying around in the airways right around LAX. So they finally decided to fine him. Shows that bureaucracy sometimes has a heart. They fined him $35 for flying an unairworthy machine. I can think of another rather extraordinary spontaneo, and some of you may have heard of this rather remarkable woman, Florence Foster Jenkins. She was came from a small town, not a small town, from a large town in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, born of a very wealthy family. And her great dream in life was that she wanted to perform at the Metropolitan Opera. And everything in her career was focused towards this. She went to the very best musical tutors, had a very profound musical knowledge, but the tragedy about Florence Foster Jenkins was that she was born with the voice of a crow. And there wasn't anything that anybody could do about this voice of hers. When she opened up her vocal cords, out came this crow-like interpretation. Well, when she got into her 60s, this remarkable woman, she decided, willy-nilly, she was going to give herself a concert and play out this daydream that she'd had all these years. And so she hired out Carnegie Hall, which is one of the great meccas of music in New York City, still is, of course. She hired herself an accompanist, a man with a rather melancholy name of Cosmo McMoon. And Cosmo McMoon would only agree to play for Florence Foster Jenkins provided he could play from behind a screen. He was fairly sure what was going to happen out there, and he did not want to have his career destroyed. She really went at it to an extraordinary degree. She designed these extraordinary dresses with great wings that came out and fell to the floor below. She had this stage mannerism, which was to carry a panier, a basket of roses, and she would reach in, and at the high note she would hurl these things out into the audience. And she selected a most complicated repertoire. It included the Bell Song from Lacme. And during the Christmas season in 1945, she gave this extraordinary concert. The place was packed to the rafters. The word had gotten around about this new coloratura from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And out onto the stage she came, and I think she thought something was going to happen to this voice of hers because of where she was, stage of this great concert hall. There's a very famous Russian sociologist named Lysenko. He was a key figure in the early days of the Stalinist regimes, and Lysenko's idea was that environment was due entirely, that performance had a lot to do with environment. And perhaps that's what she thought, that because it was the stage of Carnegie Hall, this great audience out there, her voice was going to compensate. Well, what did happen, of course, was that Cosmo McMoon, from behind his screen, played the introductory chords to whatever it was, and Florence Foster Jenkins opened up her vocal cords, and out came this familiar crow-like interpretation. And there was only one reaction the audience could come up with, which was to laugh, which they proceeded to do for an hour and a half. But the extraordinary thing was that Florence Foster Jenkins had a good time. People came hurrying backstage afterwards to commiserate with her, and she said, no, 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 I'm doing something I've always dreamed of doing, singing in a great concert hall. I had a wonderful time, she said, and it seemed to me that the audience was having a wonderful time too. They were reacting, as she put it, and she was so set up by this performance that he proceeded to give 6 more. And even more remarkable was the fact that you had to pay scalpers' prices to get in there and hear this remarkable performance. Well, she's very much an exception, and so is the guy that went up in the deck chair and the kids that fight the bulls. But in my profession, there are really quite a few of us, because one of the very first things you learn as a writer is to get as close to your subject as you possibly can. And my great predecessor in this field of participatory journalism was a writer named Paul Gallico. He was a top-notch sports journalist in the so-called golden age of sport, time of Bobby Jones in golf, Red Grange in football, Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight champion of the world, Babe Ruth, of course. And Gallico's idea was that if you were going to write about sports, you ought to learn as much as you possibly could about athletic skills at their very best. That it wasn't fair to criticize somebody for striking out in the bottom of the 9th, bases loaded World Series, unless you yourself had seen how devastating a major league curveball is. And so Paul Gallico climbed down out of the press box, so to speak, and he set himself up a whole series of confrontations to find out about athletic skills at their best. He caught Herb Pennock's curveball. He was one of the great Yankee pitchers of the time. He played tennis with Vinnie Richards, who was one of Tilden's great rivals. Played golf with Bobby Jones. Got into the ring with Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler. Dempsey was a man who didn't particularly like to find other people in the ring with him. And so Gallico was only in there for about 24 seconds. Had very little to write about the next day, couldn't remember very much. What else did he do? He went down the Olympic ski run at Garmisch, which was quite a feat because he'd never been on skis before. And he wrote about this in a book with a rather predictable title. It's called Farewell to Sport. And he went on to become a very popular novelist, lived in the south of France, wrote a book called The Poseidon Adventure, many of you may remember, made into a film. Mrs. Arra's stories, The Snow Goose, that charming parable about the Second World War. Gave up sports writing completely. Well, in this book, there is a very famous chapter called The Feel, and it's about these various episodes that he set himself up to go through to find out about athletic skills at their best. And I read this when I began writing for Sports Illustrated, and I wondered if it wouldn't be possible to do the same thing again. Not concentrating on athletic skills so much, but trying to find out what it was like to be part of a professional organization. And the only way you can do that, it's very odd, you know, we sit there, 60,000 of us in the stands, and we watch a football game, we have no idea what's truly going on down there. We know the score, we know something about the players, we know what's, we know a certain amount about it, but we have no idea what it's like to be in the huddle, or what a coach's halftime peroration is like, or how athletes wind down after a game, or how they prepare themselves for a game. All that is lost to us, and is even lost to professional reporters. It's as if a great glass shield came down to protect the participants out there from the outside world. And the only way you can get in there is to be an athlete yourself, and the chances of that in this modern world are pretty slim. There are only 6,000 professional athletes counting all the sports in this country. You know, there's 6,000 people within an acre of where we are now. The only way that you get in there, so the chances of that are very slim, so the only way you can get in there is to pretend you're sort of an ersatz athlete, and that's what I went to the editors at Sports Illustrated to try to persuade them to let me do. And they were encouraging about this. They realized it had been done before by Gallico, but they felt it could be done again. They realized, I think, that it played out the daydreams that almost all American men suffer. James Thurber once wrote that 95% of American males put themselves to sleep at night striking out the batting order of the New York Yankees. Much easier done these days, I might add, than it was Women are always very disturbed to hear this. They assume that men are daydreaming about them, but they're not. It's too complex. But I do think, though, that women have a far greater understanding of the lunacy, particularly the lunacy of sport, than men do. I used to take this very pretty English woman to watch football games in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the first one we went to, for some reason or other, I thought she understood something about football. But apparently not. We were watching the team struggling there in the mud, and after about 2 minutes she said, "You know, I think I figured this game out. What one team is trying to do is to snatch the ball away from the other." And I said I'd never really quite thought of it in such simplistic terms before, but essentially that was indeed what was going on. Well, she then asked this piercing question. She said, well, what would happen if they brought out another ball and gave it to the team which doesn't have one? And I've never been able to watch football with any sense of equanimity since then. In any case, they allowed me to do this, and the first one they helped me with was pitching in a postseason all-star game in the Yankee Stadium. And that was very appropriate for me because when I was a kid, I thought that was the highest position one could aspire to in life, to pitch in the major leagues. My great hero was a man named Carl Hubble. He was a tall, scrawny, left-handed screwball pitcher, which is a reverse curve. Hubble had thrown so many of these things that his arm was literally deformed. It sort of hung away from his body like that. Very discernible when he'd walk in from the bullpen or whatever, you could see him. When I was 8 or 9, that's the way I walked around, with my arm floating around like this, as if I could be confused for a screwball pitcher. So it was very appropriate that I be allowed to throw in this game, and at the beginning I had a lot of luck. The first two batters were Richie Ashburn, who used to play with the Phillies, and then the great Willie Mays. And I got both these gentlemen to pop the ball up into the air. It is true that Willie Mays' pop-up was caught out by the monuments that are in very deep center field in the Yankee Stadium, but nonetheless they were out. And one of the marvelous things about being a pitcher is that if you can do something like that, you can stand around on the pitcher's mound and you can relish what you've done for really quite a long period of time. I mean, you've got the ball. So I strutted around there wondering if there were any scouts in the stands and all of that, and picking up the rosin bag and fiddling with it and glorying in this thing. And of course the umpire stepped out from behind home plate, and I had to redress myself to the future, which is in almost every department a mistake. Ernie Banks came up and hit a double off the left field wall. Frank Robinson, who went on to coach the Baltimore Orioles, he hit a line drive that went right by my kneecap and went out over second base. My control then rather predictably disappeared. And finally there stepped a man up to the plate named Frank Thomas. He used to play with the Pittsburgh Pirates, great big beefy character. And he took one look at this little curveball, this little nickel curveball that I threw him, and he put it up into the triple tier of the Yankee Stadium. One of the longest home runs, I was told, hit there that summer. In fact, it was hit so far that my own reaction was that I had somehow helped with a really quite considerable engineering feat. You know, look what he and I have done together, which is not exactly the way you're supposed to feel pitching in the major leagues. But it gave me a sense, in any case, of what it is truly like to stand there on that most sacrosanct piece of American turf, pitcher's mound in the major leagues, and look down and see faces I'd only seen on bubblegum cards. And so I wrote about this for Sports Illustrated, a little book, and it was expanded into a little book called Out of My League. And it impressed the editors there enough to go on with these confrontations. The next one being, somewhat to my dismay, boxing. I wrote this very polite letter to the light heavyweight champion of the world, at the time, a man named Archie Moore. The mongoose, they used to call him, the sweet scientist. There was one appalling statistic about him in the record books, which was that he had knocked out more people than anybody else in the history of the ring. 164 souls had gone down. So you can imagine how polite my letter to him was. I wrote and asked if, in the interest of literature, underlined, would he be willing to come to New York City to the old Stillman's gym there and fight a 3-round exhibition fight. And he wrote back and said he'd be delighted to do this. Letter I received with some dismay, I might add. And sure enough, he turned up in New York, and he happened to spend the day in the company of a friend of mine, a fellow called Peter Maas, who's a writer, political writer of great reputation. Wrote a book called Serpico, many of you may have read. King of the Gypsies, a good novel. A fellow I'd always thought was a good friend. But now I'm not quite so sure, because at one point, as the two of them were wandering around New York, Archie Moore turned to Peter and said, "Hey, who is this guy, Plimpton, I have to fight in Stillman's gym tonight?" And Peter Maas was suddenly seized by this absolutely satanic idea. He said, "You've never heard of this fellow? Well, let me tell you something about him. He's a tall, gawky-looking man, but don't let that fool you. He's an ex-intercollegiate boxing champion. He's got one of the great left hooks in the business, pulverizing right hand, very fancy footwork. But the most extraordinary thing about him is his ambition, because what he truly wants to be in life is the light heavyweight champion of the world." And what he's done is to invite the press into Stillman's gym tonight and all his friends, and he is going to take you. Well, Archie Moore heard this. They were eating in a restaurant by this time, and Archie Moore reached out and he bent a spoon. And he said, "If that fellow so much as touches me, he's cooked." Well, then Peter Maas realized, a little bit like Dr. Frankenstein, that he'd created a sort of an instant monster. And so he tried to dissuade him. But once you put an idea like that into a prize fighter's mind, it sort of sticks there like a burr. And I did not like the looks of what came into the ring that night, one bit. I was the first man in the ring, sort of bouncing around, trying to work up a sweat, which is what they tell you. And down the aisle came Archie Moore, and he was dressed in a hood. A little slit in the front. You could sort of see the glint of an eye in there somewhere. And I went over and I lifted up the center strand of the rope so that he could climb into the ring a bit more easily, sort of like inviting somebody into a parlor. Big, sweet, ingratiating smile, trying to put the best face on things. And in came this grim, tank-like figure. Well, as you can see, I'm not properly constituted to fight. Very thin, delicate nose which bleeds at the slightest touch. Not only that, but I suffer from something called sympathetic response, which means that if you're hit, you weep. Well, the fight started, and in the first round, Mr. Moore made some really very aggressive moves and stuck out a couple of extremely stiff jabs. Nose here went and sort of sat down on the cheek. Quite a lot of what they used to call claret in the 19th century boxing chronicles emerged, and there was an enormous amount of sympathetic response. And I think it sort of startled Archie Moore. He'd never been in the ring with somebody both bleeding and weeping at the same time. So sympathy overwhelmed him, and he tried to hold me up for 3 rounds. I didn't particularly want to be held up. I wanted to go down and get it over with, but he kept hauling me up, kept whispering in my ear, "Breathe, man, breathe."